The old gods have been pushed to the edges of civilization, with the advancement of Christian aggression across Europe. The Norsemen, who once brutalized the West, are often remembered for their work across the North Sea, but the Baltic peoples of Prussia, Lithuania, and Latvia have not forgotten what they did. Some were happy when the Northmen converted to Christianity and had their bloodlust at least somewhat lessened, yet the Christians and their invasions were worse in a way. At least the Norse knew they were pillaging and were open about it. The Christians come to the Baltic coast, claiming to spread peace and civilization while cutting down the people there. It will not stand. Not while Galindas Pekulas, the recently crowned High Chief of Prussia, lives. He's a former peasant whose village was turned to ash by a Polish campaign some time ago. He wandered for some time before meeting the chieftain of Prussia and becoming his right-hand man. Galindas is a bit of a strange person, but strangeness brings new perspectives, which the chief appreciated. Once the chief passed away, Galindas was the obvious pick for his replacement, and so in 1178, High Chieftain Galindas has come to power in Prussia, facing a difficult position. His culture is still tribal and backwards in comparison to its neighbors, and they have a lot of motivation to take him down. Galindas will have to pull a miracle out of his pocket to defeat the Sea Raiders of Denmark and the devastating cavalry of Poland. Thankfully, the forests of Prussia are a dangerous place for those unfamiliar with it, and using his forest wardens, Galindas may yet be able to win. The premise of this video is the challenge of playing a culture that is stuck in the tribal era against enemies with significantly better technology. Now, if you're extremely GIGACHAD like me, this isn't actually that much of an issue, but it certainly complicates the game. Nonetheless, this challenge will be presented through the scope of a classic GIGACHAD story, but see what you can learn about playing smart via the gameplay. Let's bring Prussia to its rightful glory, with Galindas Pekulas at the helm. The Baltic people are, as of now, disunited by petty squabbles, and that simply cannot stand. While disunited, the Balts are doomed to failure. It might seem counter to the goal of bringing prosperity to the Baltic, but declaring war is the only way. The first war was with Skalovia, who collapsed easily, but during the war, the Christians of Pomerania under the Kingdom of Poland started an invasion. Already the Christians have come knocking, but the Pomeranians are just a small introduction. In Chelmno, the forest wardens rained arrows down on their enemies and wiped out thousands of Christians from their ambush spots along the tree line. To maintain his command over the tribes of Prussia, Galindas would have to keep his image up, and that meant pursuing hunts and feasts wherever possible, which he did. He even attended university in Stockholm, paying a lot of money to blend in as a Christian. He's looking to study the Scandinavian war strategy so he can prepare for it. He learned a lot from the trip, including getting a handle on the Norse language itself, but he quickly returned to Prussia, fearing a war could spark in his absence. Seeing that peace had reigned instead, Galindas went after more conquests to the northeast. Little tribes like the Memel-Lithuanians would fall easily, but while in Memel, he saw Danish longships landing to the north in Palanga. Danish ships were invading the neighboring Duke of Lithuania, which, if successfully carried out, would see Galindas cut off from further expansion to the north. Rather than just allow this, he declared war on Lithuania to contest the Danish conquest. Although this war is nominally against Lithuania, most of the fighting would be against the Danes, whose warriors were unfamiliar with the vast forests of the Baltic. In the Battle of Torage, the Danes failed to reinforce quickly enough during a well-orchestrated forest ambush which saw many thousands of Danes die, and which saw Galindas gain immense prestige. In case you didn't know, you gain prestige from battles if the enemy is orange-colored instead of red as a rule of thumb. This isn't always exactly how it works, but it's a pretty good heuristic. You can get a lot of prestige from inflicting heavy casualties on a powerful enemy like this, and will be farming prestige hard against the Danes. Before the Danes could escape to the seas, Galindas continued confronting them, but he became ill during the campaign. Although he's used to the cold Baltic winters, Danish corpses have been bringing miasma to the forests of Prussia. The Danes were ultimately crushed, but their allies from Scotland came in to help. For Galindas, that just means more bodies to pile up, but there was fear that this war might go on forever. Without the help of proper siege equipment, Prussian forces can't take the fortified tribes in Lithuania before the Danes and Scots can muster enough men to force Galindas back into the forests. In direct confrontations, Galindas can only win using the advantage his terrain gives him. The Northmen of Gotland even declared a separate war on him to try and take advantage of the distraction in Lithuania, but they'll have to wait. Galindas took a fight in Medenikin, which baited in many thousands of Danes and Scots, all of whom were buried in western Lithuania. Surely one day, these Danes will simply run out of people to send, right? The war with Gotland ended quickly, as the Gotlander armies were easily eradicated. At the Battle of Memel, yet more Danes and Scots were driven out, but the hordes never ended. Galindas would have to fight the Lithuanians to get them to surrender so he could negotiate some kind of peace with the Danes eventually. The Duke of Lithuania by this point was honestly happy to load the responsibility of dealing with the Danes onto someone else, and so gave up the land. The Danes, however, did not give up the war. Before they could get their footing in Palanga again, Galindas fought them in the forest and slaughtered them once more. Finally, the Danes were convinced of their inability to win and so surrendered. The prisoners of war, who were skilled enough to be worth keeping, were recruited, and the rest ransomed if possible, or else executed. Galindas entered this war a regionally respected chieftain, but exited it a legendary bulwark of the Baltic, having fended off some of the scariest fighters of the region. It was unfortunate then that while the Danes lost the war, they would win in the end. They brought with them an infection of smallpox which ravaged the land. None were safe, and while Galindas was on campaign to unite more of the Baltic, he was infected with the deadly pox. Before passing, he ended the war and developed the Prussian culture, calling on his warriors to remember the skirmishing that won them the war with Denmark. Adaptability and command of terrain will win the day for all Balts. He then passed away, leaving his throne to his only son, Glande, a mere toddler. Glande has a regent, like one would expect, but the real power of the realm lies in whoever can command the forest wardens, since defense is everything right now. That responsibility goes to the newly founded position, the noblest of the band, an accolade dedicated to archery under Gediminas, which is, conveniently, the name of the real-life founder of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. His dynasty would later have a cadet branch known as the Jagellons. If you played Europa Universalis 4, or just know some Eastern European history, you might be familiar with the Jagellons. Either way, Glande will spend his early years socializing with the fellow children of the realm and preparing for the weight of the Prussian crown upon his head. He had enough land to potentially declare himself the king of Lithuania, but as a Prussian, Lithuania didn't feel appropriate. Instead, Gediminas led some raids into Poland to test how willing the Poles are to fight. The truth is that Poland is an immensely rich land compared to Little Prussia, and if possible, it would be wise to move the realm into Poland maybe. The Poles have been fighting the Danes for control over Pomerania, and they've made moves into Lithuania. To be sandwiched between Denmark by the seas and Poland by land is precarious indeed, yet the Lithuanians have chosen treachery for the Baltic peoples. In November of 1196, while on a raiding campaign in Estonia, the Prussians were attacked by Lithuania, which had allied itself with a Polish duke. Conveniently, a massive plague broke out in Plock right around when the war began, which would hamper the Poles in their campaign. Although there were fears it might spread north and take down another chieftain in time. Glande is almost 12 years old, and so far has grown to be a just and ambitious ruler. Those two traits might make for a perfect king one day. After an initial victory at Masuria, Glande's forces went north to prepare for a Lithuanian counterattack, where in the marshes of Jeklis, the Lithuanian chief was captured. A good omen for young Glande that he could win a war in his youth. Afterwards, he toured his realm, even as a child, and established himself as a worthy successor to his father. To avenge the war Lithuania waged on him, Glande boldly attacked what remained of them. The Lithuanians betrayed the old gods, converting to orthodoxy, and their allegiance to a Pole is a betrayal to all they fought for in recent time. The combined Polish-Lithuanian army met with defeat at Kernave, and the Lithuanians surrendered. Right afterwards, Glande completed his martial education, coming of age and becoming a holy warrior. His zeal, ambition, and sense of right and wrong will guide him and his people to glory. Like his father, Glande went to Stockholm to study up on the Norse ways of war, but the rigors of higher education would prove to be greater than the boy could have expected. There are many ways to cope with stress, but Glande took to throwing away his money, which was mostly useless for him anyway. Although he returned home a mental wreck, he also returned home an exalted warlord, a master of war. He then took a trip to a holy site of Vidilism, currently occupied by Finnic pagans, to try and find guidance for the future. On his trip, he took a long detour to see some of Germany and Denmark, but ultimately arrived in Hiluma. He may have been looking for guidance, but once he arrived back in Prussia, Glande was greeted with war from Poland. This would begin the great campaign for the Prussians to find a way to survive the Polish onslaught. Boleslav V is a sick man, but one who intends to go out with some kind of victory under his belt. Masuria is the land up for grabs, which thankfully is also a land of many forests. The Poles have a numbers advantage and a general quality advantage thanks to their European steel. The poor Prussians use bows because their swords would just shatter on Polish armor, although a bow can, with enough strength, break through just about anything. Thankfully, Glande himself is an immense strategic mind with 43 advantage and the Holy Warrior trait. In the Battle of Morin, a small Polish force was enveloped and destroyed. When the Poles attempted to reinforce, believing it to be a small guerrilla force, they went all in. King Boleslav V led the army and found himself suddenly with no army when arrows pierced them. Although by capturing Boleslav, Glande effectively had won the war, it was more valuable to remove this symbol of Polish power. Boleslav was well loved in Poland. He'll have only a corpse to love now. Other captured Polish knights with enough talent were recruited. Those knights, and the Prussian ones, showed each other respect. A good warrior is a good warrior. Out of this colossal victory, Glande and his scribes penned a legend, the valiant defense, and it would surely spread quickly. On the Polish throne, Boleslav's son, Ustashi, took over and split his realm with his brother. The kingdom is over 1,000 gold in debt and the realm is disunited. Now is the time to invade. Glande, the strategic genius of Prussia, declared an invasion of Poland. He was immediately faced with the unfortunate nature of cold stone castles and his extremely simple siege engines. This will be a very long war. Thankfully, Glande is nice and young, so he's got all the time in the world. That was until he was assassinated by some German mayor with the help of some Dane. Who even are these people that would want him dead? Perhaps paid off by the Poles, perhaps motivated by religious fervor, whatever their reasons, Glande is gone, and too soon. Yet another underage monarch is taking the throne, this time Gauronas, a much more diplomatic kid than Glande. Considering the war is nearly over, it might be best to focus in on diplomacy anyway for this new Prussian-Polish kingdom. The war is already nearly done, but to siege another castle will take ages without the sapping capabilities that Glande brought to the equation. Thanks to the sacrifice of many men in an assault though, the war came to an end, but not after some unfortunate marriages led to Denmark taking a little enclave in Poland, and Upper Silesia being conquered by Hungary. Gauronas isn't exactly responsible for the Great Prussian expansion, but he's at least going to enjoy the spoils of it. He's going to rule Płock as a border domain personally, alongside his holdings in Prussia proper. Much like Glande's early years, Gauronas is spending his years among peers and picking up what knowledge and experience he can. His forest wardens will keep the realm safe while he grows up, but he's having significant administrative issues. He doesn't want to give up any land in Płock, but he can't really administer all of it for right now. Luckily, taxes and levies don't matter much. The elite soldiers of Prussia are all they need to fend off invaders, like the Russians from the east looking to conquer Poland for themselves. After an initially bad start to the war, Gauronas turned it around with a battle in Stesice, albeit with the poor news of a dissolution faction. Funnily enough, most of the dissolvers are dissatisfied Prussians who did not like that the new capital was in Płock. Their fear is that Poles, as the more cultured, advanced people, might be too influential. Gauronas' new capital in Płock is certainly nicer than the backwater in Prussia, but there's no intention, at least not yet, of reorienting the realm around Poland. In the wake of the dissolution faction's demands, further rebellions were emboldened, and so the realm fell into an era of total civil war. The Russians were still invading, but they'll have to wait. Battle after battle saw the many Fletchers of Prussia working overtime to make arrows for the thousands of forest wardens, firing hundreds to thousands of arrows each battle. So far, the wars are all going well, except the Independence faction, whose castles will be hard to siege. The Russians surrendered in October of 1217. The money from it will feed the treasury for years to come. Oh, and I came across this kind of bug in August 1219. I'm almost certain this is a display issue, since I swapped over to the other side to see what the stats showed and the numbers were normal. Pretty cool to see such huge numbers. If they were real numbers, my army would have died within seconds. I did lose the battle though, so instead of taking responsibility, I'll blame the visual glitch. There were two wars that ultimately I surrendered in this time. One was for control over one county in the west, Lubusz, and the other for another county, Such. These small losses will be recovered sometime, but for now, peace is on the menu for Prussian Poland. Unfortunately, much of Gauronas' brother's territory that the two split has been conquered by Denmark, which couldn't really be stopped while Gauronas himself was in turmoil. It's time to tour the realm, as most of Poland is, as of yet, unknown to the Prussian administration. The king visited most of the vassals around the Vistula, but neglected the western portion, which was only tenuously held thanks to the Danish inheritance. During the tour, Gauronas came of age, becoming a great eminence. Rather than focus on diplomacy per se, he'll be focusing on the world of travel, as he's taken a deep interest in his realm after touring it. One day he'll reclaim and chart the regions of Poland currently ruled by Denmark, with some luck. Speaking of Denmark, whose king is now Polish, by the way, they're invading Prussia to complete their conquest of the Baltic coastline. The Danish Poles made the mistake of landing and immediately attacking Gauronas' army. They were slaughtered without proper time to acclimate to the land. The war was easily won. In a strange change of course, Gauronas, looking for a diplomatic peace with Denmark's king, invited him to a feast in his honor. It was under the pretense that Odon of Denmark was a worthy opponent, and that great warriors would always feast together. Amazingly, the king accepted, and so Odon traveled to Puok for a feast with the people he was just at war with. The feast was nearly interrupted by a Bohemian declaration of war, but this feast was more important, so the war would be ignored for now. The celebration went well, but the war in Bohemia did not. The Bohemians were a powerful force, and Garonas, although talented, is not a warlord like his predecessor. With the loss of Lower Silesia, Poland has been partitioned to some extent, with only its eastern portion really being properly owned, although as long as Puok continues to be under Prussian control, they'll be fine. The realm prospered despite these setbacks. Garonas went to university to become a virtuoso arbitrator, and he hosted a tournament in Prussia, which he won with no cheating whatsoever, of course. He even conquered the island of Hiluma, which is a Vitalist holy site, but while doing so, the Danes came for another war. It seems that great feast from before did not hold long-term sway over Odon of Denmark. With Norwegian support this time, the Danes have landed once again in Prussia, but because Garonas was off in Estonia fighting, the Northmen had time to settle in and complete a siege. Without better siege equipment, the reclamation of lost land would take forever, and this proved to be lethal for Garonas' armies. Although they won a fight in the forests near Masuria, they could not reclaim the tribes without being caught out of position and losing decisive battles. This was when some of Garonas' Polish subjects, who had come to respect him and his treatment of them, offered to him knowledge of the trebuchet, which up to now had been used to destroy his walls. The cultural exchange between Poles and Prussians was quite the miracle, given how staunchly traditional Poles can be, but in the short time that the Prussians have ruled in Poland, they've come to get along well, with mutual benefit between the two cultures, and seeking to further that acceptance, Garonas changed the census to mark every Pole and Prussian equally as Lenkinas, which is the Lithuanian word for lech, in reference to the foundation myth of the Polish people. I'm using the Lithuanian word because it's the closest I can get to a Prussian word, considering that language is long dead. Based on what little we know of Old Prussian phonology, the word Lenkinas might have been something more like Lenkinas, since palatalization was more prevalent in Old Prussian than Lithuanian, but it's hard to say which specific sound would be palatalized and when. Okay, linguistics rant over. This culture will feature all the same stuff as Prussian, with the added bonus of Polish coney raids. Now we've got powerful bows for the forests and swift cavalry for the plains, which composes the vast majority of the terrain in my realm. Even more critically, the introduction of crossbows to the army will make the heavy armor of the Huscarls and Varangians from Denmark into Swiss cheese. Using some mercenaries alongside the new crossbows, Garonas inflicted a massive defeat on the Danes, but he wasn't out of the woods yet. He instead met another defeat in Pomerania, since the trebuchets weren't ready for a siege yet. Once they were ready, they finally took back some key fortresses in Prussia, and the war came to a white peace. While it may have been possible for Garonas to win the war, it likely wasn't worth it in the face of another invasion from Ruthenia. By now, Garonas is confident enough in his army that despite the Ruthenian invasion, he's feasting in Puok anyway, where reports of military successes made the beer flow ever more. The legend of the valiant defense against Poland from years ago came to a close at this feast, where Garonas revealed the new story, depicting the valor of his forest wardens. The story is complete in all its exaggerations and legendary tales of perfect shots from the tree line. Of course, with the newfound acceptance of the Poles in this realm, the original story's emphasis on the savage Polish invaders has instead shifted towards a more ambiguous riders from the Vistula. The chronicle is long, incorporating stories of the heroics of Galindas, Glande, and Garonas. These three generations of Prussian men and the legend about them are essentially the founding mythology of the Lenkinas and their kingdom, Lenkia, which has so effectively carved itself out as a kingdom between the Russians and Danes. It was with this new Prussian mythology that the kingdom of Lenkia formally adopted Catholicism, which might sound counterintuitive, but it was an important step for Garonas to actually bring about a stable and prosperous realm. Ultimately, the Vitalist ways were in the past myth and legend, and the modern world is all about monotheism. Garonas took some time to inspect his realm from here, which he had toured a while ago. Tours are useful but mostly involve meeting with local power holders rather than understanding the landscape of the region. He went to Łomża, one of his own counties, with the goal to shift some of his claims further out. The Danes, although now fellow Christians, are certainly not friends of the Lenkinas, and claims to their errant territory in Lithuania could prove valuable. The successful survey did indeed prove these claims, as Lenkia's maps were updated to include land that seemed to be within the borders of Danish Lithuania. Disputed claims can only be solved in one way, really, but in good time, surely. Another benefit of Christianization was access to more of the world's knowledge through priests and nobles spreading news. Looking at reports from the east, much of the world is in turmoil. Castile and France are wrapped up in bitter conflict over control of Normandy and Brittany, while England's king has, through some strange inheritance disputes, laid claims to the Duchy of Hanover, as it might later be known. The Maghrebis have united under the highly aggressive Almohadi Islamic Caliphate in North Africa, controlling the gold and salt trade betwixt the Sahara Desert. The great Ayyubid Empire has expanded to absolutely dominate much of the Nile River, Arabia, and even a little piece of Asia Minor, but their advancement was cut off by the Ilkhanate, the spoilers of Byzantium. That benefit of access to information is a double-edged sword, though. What the world brought in information, it equally brought in disease and pestilence. Gauronus and his many kids caught smallpox, with some of his children dying and others being left blinded. Gauronus himself was lucky enough to survive, and the wake-up call of seeing his children die motivated him to get some of his sons married. His firstborn, Budo, shall be married to a French princess, Hildegard, daughter of King Aldebert. A French alliance legitimizes the realm and provides it with military backup just in case anything risky should ever come up. The confidence of French support gave Gauronus the will to fight the Danes and kick them out of Lithuania, or at least the coastline to Lithuania. What will remain of Danish Lithuania will be merely an enclave. With the power of the trebuchet, the formerly impenetrable Norse forts along the coast were broken down. The Danes had no chance, and so their little jaunt into Lithuania is mostly over, although another war will have to come later to take what remains of Danish Lithuania. To help unite the identity of the Prussians and Poles further, Gauronus integrated the Kingdom of Lithuania into Lenkia. Now, Lenkia is a huge kingdom, and a unification of the Balts and Poles into one legal entity. Using the taxes he can now levy on his Lithuanian subjects, Gauronus is building up his realm and continuing to inspect the land to ensure the tax numbers are accurate. It's been a long time since peace actually came to this land, but now that it's there, the people are loving it. Gauronus is more than happy to keep an eye on the war-torn world for his own entertainment, while knowing his land is quite safe after proving itself to every neighboring realm. He even went to a tournament in Bohemia, and as a battle-hardened man of war, he won every game at the tournament. Already, the exploits of the Pekolas family from the Valiant Defense legend were widely spread, but this tournament alone proved that greatness to anyone questioning it. Check out all that Hastelooter experience, by the way. Nice. It's a good time to leave too, since the plague has begun its descent on Prague. The so far courteous interactions with the Catholics has led to a further evolution of the Lenkia culture, which has become a culture of religious blending. How one worships just isn't all that important in this culture. They have stronger ties to language and customs than gods. Via his mother, Gauronus inherited a claim to the kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia, which had often been a thorn in his side for some time. The Russians so often eye up their western cousins, trying to control the bountiful fields of the Vistula, but now the tables have turned. Once again, Gauronus' powerful trebuchets made short work of all the walls they found, and soon the southern Russians were subjugated. Their treasures were carted off to Płock and hung in the royal court, while Gauronus looked over the new Russian subjects with indecision. The Russian Rurikid family is firmly entrenched throughout the entire Russian Empire, and the local population of the land there loves them. Rather than try and oust the Russians, Gauronus is looking to make of them loyal vassals, but somewhat autonomous vassals nonetheless. This would come with its own challenges, including complex interfamilial succession laws, which resulted in a pretty large portion of Ruthenia leaving the realm to an inheritance in Vladimir, but that wasn't so bad. In a way, the allowance of that inheritance on Gauronus' part would help convince the Russians that he wasn't so bad. Over the coming years of peace, except for one doomed crusade, Gauronus was even able to convince many boyars further into central Russia to submit to him for protection from the more expansionistic king of Vladimir. Although family ties people together, sometimes it can push them apart, and so Russia was awkwardly divided between the Prussians and Russians, with a few independent agents whose fate had yet to be decided. Danish Lithuania was wiped up, and some of the borders with Vladimir were altered in accordance to more inconvenient inheritances, but this would become the status quo between Russia and Prussia for some time, and that time would continue all the way to Gauronus' death by natural causes. He was the last of the three mythological Prussian founders, and he left his throne to his grandson, Jaugutis, who is the son of the French princess and Budo. He's just barely a man himself. Lenkia, a prospering realm, has entered the medieval era with a legendary start, and with dynastic connections to France and a tenuous divide of territory with the Rurikids, has become one of the modern medieval realms with full recognition from papal and secular authorities. Yagutis' rise to the throne was met with no real opposition, but it was met with a handful of Russian lords breaking off their fealty, citing that their fealty was sworn to Garonis, not his lineage, which is of course a lie, but it was easy to suppose that a proud Russian dynasty like the Rurikids felt uncomfortable being vassals to a teenager. In line with the customs of the time, Yagutis married his cousin, Peyronel, from France, in the hopes of bringing his dynasty ever closer to the Capetians. Some say he had great ambitions for that kingdom over there, and some in the French kingdom warned King Aldebert of his nephew's coming treachery. He scoffed at the idea, convinced that a mere boy couldn't touch the majesty of France. After all, Aldebert had his own grand ambitions in mind. The French king, after entering a personal union with Ireland and splitting Scotland in half with the English, found himself an emperor, albeit one in the prison of some Iberian duke. I genuinely do not know how that happened. Regardless, Emperor Aldebert is the envy of Europe with his grand crown, and there's something to be said for envy when it comes to Yagutis. The French kept their eyes on their rivals in Castile, who still laid claim to Brittany, and now even some of Armagnac. This will be the perfect cover for a future campaign Yagutis has the audacity to plan. First, though, comes the war to prove himself to his very own realm. Whenever a king dies, the vassals will demand more freedom, and the new king must show them why such a thing cannot happen. It's a tired ritual, but one which defines the most modern kingdoms of Europe. In this case, it's not a hard task for Yagutis. He still has the battle-hardened forest wardens of his land to fight on his behalf, and they're fighting in their home territory. A few battles here, a couple occupations there, and the vassals have been appropriately cowed, and then our ambitious king met with his humble mother, Hildegard Capet, who was Budo's wife, you might remember. Budo would have been king had he not been outlived by his own father, Garonas. As the grandson of a French king, on the maternal line, Yagutis himself has a relatively weak claim to France's throne, but Hildegard, the daughter of a king, has a much stronger claim. When Aldebert the Good passed away from the illness he incurred while in an Iberian prison, his son Charles, Yagutis' own cousin and brother-in-law, took the throne as a minor. To convince Hildegard that she should allow her son to elevate her to the status of queen was not easy. She's not exactly a power-seeking type, but she's a mother, and to see her son prosper is one of her greatest joys. Hildegard agreed to be a pretender to the French throne, and so the families were torn asunder for one man's ambition. Here's the problem with an army that relies on knowledge of the terrain and ambush-oriented tactics. It does horribly in a naval landing on foreign shores. The French armies completely decimated the Prussian army. Not a single man made it out. Every single one was either killed or captured, and suddenly that elite force of forest wardens with veterans from across some decades of rulership were completely wiped out. Amazing how, after the legendary reign of the three mythical Prussians, that so quickly it could all collapse. Yagutis, rather than allow this embarrassment to haunt him and his lineage, proceeded to tell his court that the army made a successful and safe landing in Normandy, but that a second army would be needed to attack the soft French underbelly in Aquitaine. A new army was raised, with Yagutis sweating bullets about the outcome of this war. A loss this significant would see his entire lineage tarnished and shame upon his family for good. Even Hildegard was not safe, for she was caught fornicating with some French noble and imprisoned for it. First of all, ew, Yagutis thought. Although of course such intercourse was how he himself was created, the Prussian king found it still weird to imagine his mother in such a position. Or multitude of positions perhaps. He banished the thoughts to focus on the war effort. Maybe he could turn the imprisonment of his mother into an advantage. The French king certainly won't earn any favors in terms of honor for executing her, as it would be kinslaying to do so. That should ensure the war doesn't end outright. A war to free his mother will sell well among the soldiers who are not just fighting for their king's commands, but instead for the reunification of a happy family. Especially with the birth of a royal heir, Cugis, the whole family restoration idea really caught among the soldiers, and before long a new army was ready to sail to Bordeaux. The true purpose behind this spot is that it's a forested area. A new forest, maybe, but the trees hide men all the same. After taking Albret, the French army retaliated, fighting in Bordeaux and winning, but not with nearly the decisiveness of the previous fight. The overzealous enemy chased the Prussians down. This would be their end. A smaller French force arrived, feeling confident, but the Prussians were hiding in the trees, as usual, and laid an excellent ambush. Finally, a real victory, and all thanks to the trees once more. The army fanned out, occupying more forests and using them to control the terrain on which fights would occur. With each fight, the new forest wardens, young men and teens most of them, learned more and more about the passages and ambush locations of the region. They only slaughtered more and more Frenchmen with each fight, and soon believed that their king's mother would be free and on her rightful throne. This is where things get complicated though. You see, the Kingdom of France is not the Empire of France. Hildegard, while still in prison, ended up inheriting the kingdom herself somehow. I'll be totally honest, I don't know how it happened simply because I didn't see it happen, until I just happened to see that my mother was a queen. What happens in this case is that the claimant I was using is no longer in my court, and therefore I can't use her to push the claim. But what is also happening is that I have become the son of a queen. Therefore, I get an implicit claim on the Kingdom of France. The extremely rare implicit claim war is here now, as technically, Yaugudis is fighting to enforce his implicit claim to France against his imprisoned mother, who is being defended by Charles, his own cousin. Ah yes, I do love the implication of the unification of medieval houses. The war finally ended, with Hildegard dethroned and replaced by Yaugudis. His first order of business, before even a coronation, was to negotiate the freedom of his mother, but turns out bitter Charles refused to give her up. He'd rather imprison his own kinswoman and treat her like some bargaining chip than return her. Well, that's something Yaugudis will have to solve later then. Instead, he formalized the personal union between the Kingdom of Lenkia and France as independent entities, separate from the Empire of Francia. The empire itself, having lost its main kingdom, was in a strange place, but an empire it still was, with what it held in Burgundy, Ireland, and Scotland. It's time for a feast, with Yaugudis saying his mother was too tired to attend and surely not still locked in a dungeon. Don't get me wrong, he loves his mother, but he's patient and reclusive and easily embarrassed with how he handled the war and all. No, this is a time for celebration, not explanation. The lords of France were of course invited, and some came, while others did not, out of protest. In good time, they will come to accept their new rulers, although Yaugudis put an effort into maintaining French autonomy for the most part, demanding nothing more than taxes and men. Despite that good faith gesture, there was, of course, a rebellion from the French. If the French emperor could not win, how could the vassals hope to win? They did not win. For their crimes, the French lord would not be stripped of their titles, but instead left to rot, until his own mother be released from prison. The hope is to break their allegiance to the emperor by convincing them that the reason they have to eat slop in a dank dungeon is because their emperor is abandoning them for his petty family troubles. Maybe, just maybe, the French lords would see Yaugudis as a fairer ruler. Some rulers only recognize power though. The French emperor is powerless, but Yaugudis has more to prove. Those old Russian concessions, they have no reason to continue. Why concede what can easily be won? Another great war, on the wave of enthusiasm from France, will see a great empire from sea to shining sea born. The king of Vladimir had no chance at winning, especially not in the forests of Eastern Europe, which are more home to the wardens than to anyone. Lenkia has exploded in size now, leaving it too petty a title for the great realm. A new empire has been born, which will overshadow the Frankish Empire and the Holy Roman Empire, and even the Roman Empire, famously. This empire is called Tarpiuru, which is my best guess at the Lithuanian word for between the seas, or Intermarium. I don't speak a word of Lithuanian, I just put between and ocean into Google Translate and hoped it would be some kind of cool word. Tarpiuru is indeed a pretty cool sounding word, so we're going with it. The greatness of the name comes from the fact that it is not just a reference to the Baltic and Black Seas, which are the most obvious bodies of water that contain the empire, but also the North Sea and Mediterranean Sea, which is where France is contained. This is an empire not just between some seas, but between all seas, at least all the important ones in Europe. Tarpiuru's founding was met with another rebellion which was easily crushed, and now Emperor Yaugudis is on top of the world, with the exception that his mother was still in prison. By the time Yaugudis hit his 40s, he heard news of his mother's passing in the Frankish prison. She gave up everything for her boy, but our emperor here liked to think that her sacrifice fulfilled her in a way. She could, if she were still alive, claim to be responsible for this great empire in a way. Yaugudis' melancholy came on around the same time and was worsened by the death of his only son, Kugas. The succession will have to be safe with his daughters unless he can have another son in the coming years. He did manage to have one, who he gave the name Ferensavis to, which is a name I made up, based on what I think a Lithuanian speaker might think Francais might sound like as a name, with that little vowel and S added to the end, as so often happens in these Baltic languages. If you happen to be Lithuanian, by the way, let me know what you think of my linguistic extrapolations. I know almost nothing about the Baltic languages. As one even greater show of force, Yaugudis went to war to reclaim Silesia from the Holy Roman Empire, which had taken it many years ago. The war went smoothly, with barely a response from the Germans. Through occupations alone, Yaugudis won the war, and the Germans gave up Silesia after ruling it for so long. An anticlimactic war needs some kind of engagement, so instead, he hosted a tournament at home, which would feature various reenactments of the great battles from the French and Russian wars. Naturally, Yaugudis won every event with absolutely no tyranny whatsoever, but this sort of unfairness is just typical of the time, you see. Anyway, this is where Yaugudis finally hit an age where he's slowing down. He went to school in Constantinople in this time and enjoyed this realm with a tour, but he didn't do much else. What more is there to do really, besides of course fighting off another ill-fated French rebellion? That was a task mostly delegated to the Marshal by this point. He even got himself a new prestigious wife, Rodislava from the Kingdom of Vladimir. Now that their territorial disputes were over, why not make friends, right? Besides, Ferrand Savis would need a mother figure, especially after his recent run-in with some bullies. Poor kid. Once he grew up, Jogudis got him married to another Rurikid princess, Gramislava, and so the Rurikid-Pekolas connection would deepen. In his free time, Jogudis took to reading about his ancestors. The old Valiant Defense Chronicle and its stories of greatness with regards to his grandfather and his fathers before him. Maybe it's just some nostalgia, or maybe it's an old man's eccentricity, as Jogudis is in his 60s now. But no matter what it is, the role of Christianity in Tarburu hasn't really been much, some would argue. What principles have really given the Prussians their great lives that they have now? It's always been an adherence to nature that kept the Prussians safe. There's no telling what spiritual consequences the whole realm could be accruing with their dedication to some false god. The reintroduction of the Baltic pagan gods swept the realm with some modern reforms. The focus on the divinity of birth and nature of course stuck around, but with some adaptations to better suit the mostly Christian subjects of the realm. A return to the old gods will surely put Jogudis in the history books, but how long the realm will stick to it is another question. Alongside this change to the realm, the emperor also integrated some of his Russian subjects' cultural traditions into his own way of life. In Russia, the people of Prussia and Poland are called the Lechnitsky Baltiskaya, and I'd like to say that I have no idea if that's any kind of comprehensible Russian, but it sounds cool, okay? The name recognizes the combination of Polish and Prussian origin that the culture has, but over time, the Russian language has come to dominate the land, if only out of convenience. Trade from the east is mostly conducted in Russian, and so almost every resident of metropolitan Tarburu spoke it almost from birth. One last vengeful war against the Danes saw every rival of the Prussians put to their knees, and so Tarburu was unmatched by any out there. No land between the seas could ever stand up to this new empire, which rivals the Romans in splendor by now. As part of the permanent establishment of this empire, there was a need for Tarburu to become something greater than just a hereditary title. Institutions create permanence, and this is best demonstrated through the Catholic Church of all things. No single kingdom or empire can claim to be the Catholic Church, for the Catholic Church is a permanent institution. It is like a Roman road, a piece of nature really, a fixture upon which the world is built. The lands between the seas will become similar in nature, as Jogudis implemented an imperial bureaucracy similar to that of the long-standing Roman Empire. He hopes this realm will last long beyond his own life, which there likely isn't too much more of left. He's 70 years old now, but he's a religious leader, emperor, and father. Jogudis consecrated his bloodline after bringing Denmark into his empire as a vassal, and then fought the Germans for control over Lotharingia, which he considered to be a French territory, and therefore his territory. Tarburu has grown from the humble groves of Prussia into an immense sea-spanning empire. The attention that such an empire inevitably acquires has led to two things. First, a great plague, which has spread right to Plock and infected the great emperor, and second, a crusade from the Pope himself. There can only be room for one permanent institution, it seems, and the Pope intends to be that institution. Jogudis did survive the plague, although his wife did not, but he ended up dying of grief and complications later in the long term that left his son Ferrand Savis in charge of the realm in its time of need against the crusade. To be completely honest, I'm building up this crusade like it's any kind of threat, but if you played CK3, then you know crusades are disorganized messes of chaos that really don't pose much of a threat to a relatively large empire like this one. Not to mention, the Tarpuran army is over 60,000 men strong now, which is about as much as the Crusaders in their entirety can muster. One major failure of the European Crusaders is their lack of knowledge about foraging in lands like these. The winters are cold, and the forests bereft of good food. One must hunt, or get creative with their cooking to really eat what's around here. Most of the knights from their cushy courts aren't willing to boil acorns into a soup for sustenance or to track a deer through the winter to feed their families. The forest wardens are experts in survivalist warfare, and the cold of winter and her starving snow would claim more foreign lives than the Prussian army itself. Although fresh to the throne, Ferrand Savis ended up having many health issues due to the stress of the invasion. While he was winning handily, he still wasn't exactly a well-seasoned emperor. Nonetheless, the crusade ended in January of 1328, and Ferrand Savis took a well-earned break in his throne room. On the walls of his courtroom hung portraits of the great Prussian founders Galindas, Glandet, and Garonas. Glandet in particular caught Ferrand Savis' eye. He was ripped from the world before even his 30th birthday, and increasingly, the Emperor felt he might too pass away early. He had dealt with his stress through flagellation, and it turns out that the scars of a leather whip can quickly degrade the body and even get infected. Regardless, Varangian took a seat upon his throne, considering where the realm could go from here. The world is in his hands, really, and with the wealth of France, the ferocity of Prussia, and the determination of Russia, he would be unstoppable. This is where the chronicle of the Pekulus house ends. From the edges of society and from desperation and survival has come a beacon of civilization and bastion for those rejected by wider Christian society. While for a time, Prussia and her people looked as if they might not survive the onslaught of conflict sent their way, they have instead shown that duress is the ultimate flame that tempers the metal of a people's soul. The Intermarium will live on, rolling from sea to shining sea until the sea is dry. Thank you for your time.